What's going on, everyone? John here from bootcamp.com. Welcome to another video. In today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the spinal cord as well as some of the tracts which we can see in the spinal cord, both the ascending and descending tracts and their organization throughout. So if you want, you can pause and take a look at the outline, but let's just get started. Now, when we're looking at a cross-section through the spinal cord, you're going to see this distinctive pattern and how the tissue is organized. We're going to see the dark matter located more centrally, and this is going to be surrounded by the white matter out here, 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 and here. Now, in the gray matter, this is where we're going to find the cell bodies of neurons, and this is going to act as a point of communication between neurons going in both directions. Now, neurons don't extend throughout the body. They connect with other neurons, which extend their axons to different areas. So found within the gray matter, this is going to be a point of communication between two different neurons, specifically a cell body and an axon. And found within the white matter, this is where we're going to find those axon fibers as they're traveling either up or down throughout the spinal cord. Now, this also serves to transmit the signals either from a higher cortical area down to a level of the spinal cord, or from that level of the spinal cord up to a higher cortical area. Now, the gray matter of the spinal cord is going to be divided into the ventral horn, which is going to be found anteriorly. So this would be anterior, this would be posterior. So we'd have a ventral horn right here, another ventral horn right here. Now you can see we have this lateral horn coming out right here and right here. This is only going to be found in the thoracic and upper lumbar region between T1 and L2. This is where we're going to find the sympathetic neurons, which are going to control sympathetic output. And if you remember, this is only found through T1 to L2, so this lateral horn is only found in those sections of the spinal cord. And then as we move posteriorly, we have this posterior, or we have our dorsal horn found right here. So the ventral horn, this is where we're going to have our motor neurons, and the dorsal horn, this is where we're going to have our sensory neurons. And you can also see the white matter is divided into specific columns as it is arranged around the dark matter. On either side, we have our two lateral columns. We also have a posterior column, which is going to be found between the two dorsal horns of the gray matter. And then we also have an anterior column, as you can see right here, found between the two ventral horns of the gray matter. So when we look at a histological section with a specific stain, you can see we're going to have our dorsal horns right here. This will be our lateral horn, and this right here will be our ventral horn. We're going to have our posterior column back here, our anterior column found right here, and our two lateral columns found on either side. Now, the rest of the videos in this series are going to be focused more on discussing the white matter and how it's broken down into different sections of the spinal cord and the types of information which travels in those sections. We're going to have ascending spinal tracts, which are carrying sensory information from the body up to the higher cortical areas to be processed. We're also going to have descending tracts, which are carrying motor innervation from the higher cortical areas down to the body to go and perform a certain function. So you can see on this diagram, we have all our motor descending pathways, or efferent pathways. These are going to be identified in red, and these can be subdivided into pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. And pyramidal and extrapyramidal just refer to whether they're passing through the pyramids of the medulla, which you'll come to become familiar with in future videos. So that's how they're divided into pyramidal and extrapyramidal. Now, you can see we also have the sensory or ascending afferent pathways, and these are divided into the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, as well as the spinocerebellar tracts and the anterior lateral spinothalamic tracts. So we're going to identify these and break these down in the next couple slides. So starting off with the sensory or the ascending pathways, you can see they're found on the right side of the diagram in blue. So starting off posterior, this section of the spinal cord is referred to as the posterior column, as we mentioned at the beginning of the lesson. So this entire area is the posterior column, and this is specifically dedicated to carrying sensory information up to higher cortical areas. So found towards the midline, we're going to have a structure known as the fasciculus gracilis. And the fasciculus gracilis, we'll talk about this in more detail in future videos, but this is going to be carrying sensory information from the lower limbs. Just lateral to that, that's where we're going to find our fasciculus cuneatus. And the fasciculus cuneatus, this is going to be carrying sensory information from the upper limb. And a way to remember this, and I'll also repeat it in future videos, is that our fasciculus cuneatus has a U in it, and that U you can use to remember that it's providing, or it's carrying information from the upper limb. So cuneatus, U, upper limb, and also begins with a C, and this indicates that it's joining at the cervical region. So all this information is coming in at that cervical region because it's coming from that upper limb. Now let's identify our anterior lateral pathways, and these might be new terms to you. These are the spinothalamic pathways. So the anterior lateral and spinothalamic, those are synonymous pathways, and there's two of them. We have an anterior spinothalamic pathway and a lateral spinothalamic pathway. Now the lateral spinothalamic pathway is going to be found right here, and you can see it's just cupping the lateral aspect of the ventral horn. So here's our ventral horn right here. And our lateral spinothalamic, it's going to be kind of wrapping around that ventral horn. Whereas if we follow this hook around, you can see we have this structure right here. This is going to be that anterior spinothalamic tract. Now finally, we have our Spinocerebellar, and again, these are divided into a ventral and dorsal, and you can kind of identify these based on their names. So the ventral one, this is going to be more ventral or anterior, and the dorsal one, this will be more posterior or dorsal. So that leaves us to these two structures on the most lateral aspect of the spinal cord. This is going to be our ventral or anterior spinocerebellar, and this will be our dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar. All right, now that we've discussed the sensory pathways, let's hop on over to the other side and discuss the motor pathways. Now, when I say other side, I'm just referring to this diagram. Of course, these pathways are intermingled on either side. It's not localized to only one side or the other. These are intermingled. So with that said, let's go and break down the motor pathways. So again, reiterating, we have the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal tracts. Now, the pyramidal tracts, those are going to be the anterior corticospinal and the lateral corticospinal. Sometimes we would just refer to these as the corticospinal tract. So our lateral corticospinal is going to be this large triangular shaped structure found right here on the most lateral aspect of the spinal cord, found between the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. So this wedge shape right here, that's going to be the lateral corticospinal tract. And our anterior corticospinal, it's going to be the most anterior and the most medial. So it's going to be this structure right here. Again, anterior, and then this is the lateral corticospinal tract found right there. Now let's talk about some of the extrapyramidal tracts. We have our Rubrospinal, our Reticulospinal, and the Reticulospinal is going to be divided into a medial and lateral, and then we have our Vestibulospinal tract. So looking at the Rubrospinal, as we talk about it more in future videos, you'll come to realize that this travels with the lateral corticospinal. Just think of them as holding hands and walking together. And this is going to be found right here. So this structure found just on the anterior aspect of our lateral corticospinal tract, this is going to be our Rubrospinal tract. And then on the anterior aspect of that lateral corticospinal tract, this is where we're going to find our lateral reticulospinal tract. So lateral reticulospinal tract. And then we also have our medial reticulospinal tract. Medial reticulospinal tract. So we have the lateral reticulospinal, found on the lateral aspect in the lateral column. And then our medial reticulospinal, this is actually going to be found in the anterior column, but it's more towards the midline. So it's referred to as the medial. And then finally, we have our vestibulospinal tract, which is going to be this structure right here, found just lateral to our anterior corticospinal tract. So this is our vestibulo, or a VST, vestibulospinal tract right there. So of course, that was just an overview of the localization of these different tracts. As we go through the other videos, we're going to build on this information. We're going to discuss each tract in detail, and hopefully by the end of this, all this information will make sense to you and it will be easy to identify these and also understand what type of information is passing through them, what happens when they're damaged, and all that fun stuff. But that's basically it for this video. We covered the spinal cord and cross section and the ascending and descending tracts, which we can see throughout. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you all in the next one.